Well, hello, everybody. My name is Mike Pucciarelli, the creator of Still Life Photography, Michael Pucciarelli. I changed the name to Still Life and Landscape of Michael Pucciarelli because I included a new landscape section on my YouTube channel. And tonight, I'll be talking about landscape photography with the camera R5, R6, equipment, and also the Adobe software. So my question is, do we have any Canon shooters out there, or Nikon, or Sony? You could just, respond. You could put the answer in the chat or just shout it out.
Sony.
Okay, Sony. Sony's a very good camera. I like Sony. I know people that are happy with Sony. So tonight, we'll be talking about some equipment that I use, some basic equipment that I use. Yeah, I like the Canon Rebel 2. That's how I started. Okay. And I'll be talking about the camera settings for the R5 and R6. And the screens are very familiar. Then I'll have a Photoshop demo, an Adobe Camera Raw demo. And then I'll end with the screenshot presentation, of Photoshop and Adobe Camera Raw. This will answer more of your questions. Let me go to my portfolio. This is my latest light painting. Tonight, we would talk about how I get these images, where I use a variable N neutral density filter. I reduced exposure by 4 stops. I have like aperture 18 with a 5-second shutter. And these are waterfalls of Isle of the Skye in Scotland. And these are all with either the R6 or the R5. This is a Great Falls. And these are other, this is one of the falls of Isle of the Skye in Scotland. This is another waterfall area in Scotland. Great Falls. Still life using continuous lighting. Another light painting. Light paint my own car. This is my latest earlier light paintings. So some equipment that I use is a wired cable release. And since you use the R5 and the R6, the cable on the left is for the R6. The cable on the right, it works with a Canon D7, but it also works with a Canon R5. So they're both cameras, the Canon 7D and the R5, they could use the same cable release. And the many cable releases out there, you could use your phone, you could use another remote. So you want to make sure you're comfortable, with your whatever cable release you're using to hold the camera still. Because when you do waterfalls, you definitely want to use a cable release. You want to avoid pressing the shutter. I know in other photography I could press the shutter like with still life, but light painting, waterfalls, you definitely want to use like a cable release. Also, feel free to, I'll check the chat for questions, and you can just feel free to interrupt me with any questions. This is another way. It's a wireless shutter remote. And again, this remote on the right will work with the 7D R5, and the one on the left will work with the R6. basically the same, remote, but the wire's a little different. And you can be 80 plus meters of remote distance. You have 30 possible channels to work with. It's a very good timer. You have 2 seconds for the hour, minute, and second. So it's 2 digits, 2 digits, 2 digits format. And this is a lot more flexible than the wired release. You have a lot more room to move around. In other types of photography, this is what I use. It's the remote. But when I do landscape, I just like to use the wired release. And the small, this receiver, this will fit in any, major modern hot shoe of any modern Canon camera. Now, the many filters I will discuss, and an important filter for waterfalls, I recommend either a 2 or 3 stop neutral density filter, or maybe a variable N neutral density filter. We could go between 2 and 8 stops. And then there's the 10 full stop, which means 10 stop neutral density filters, you reduce the exposure by 10 stops. And a good way to use the 10 stop neutral density filter, suppose you're, photograph at a bright sunny day. You go as wide as you can go on the lens, but you want to narrow the shutter by 2 stops. You should be able to get a pretty good image. And the variable N is very flexible. You just turn the ring, and you probably want to reduce it by 4 stops. And that's where you want to use an aperture of 18 and maybe 5 seconds. And then when I first started out landscape photography, I would either use a 2 or 3 stop neutral density filter. I'd be at aperture 8 with a shutter of 5 seconds, and I'd get like a nice, white silky waterfall appearance. But you can also do that with the 10 stop or the variable N. Now the circular polarizer, that's great for bringing more detail to the sky. It's also great for taking out glares. It's great for putting like a slight vignettes on the sky. Give the photograph more impact. You got a regular UV filter for low light. You got a split tone, which is similar to the circular polarizer, where you can make like the top part of the photograph more dark than the other part. But for waterfalls, those shots I showed you in the portfolio, I'd recommend either a variable N, a 10 stop, or just a 2 or 3 stop neutral density filter. So this is the 10 stop neutral density filter, where you're reducing the exposure by 10 stops. Again, like I said, it's great for a super bright sunny day. Now, the best light to use is when you have a cloudy sky, when the light's filtered. Early in the morning or late at night. You want to try to avoid harsh sunlight. I know sometimes you may not have a choice, but you just come back when the light is not so harsh. But this 10 stop neutral density filter is great if you have a lot of light on the waterfall. You go as wide as you can go with the lens, and then you narrow the aperture by 2 stops. You should be able to get a nice waterfall with like the white silkiness. And that's one exposure. And the advantages with this will fit my 7200 with an aperture of 4. This filter will also fit the 67 meter, will also fit my 35 meter. And the 58 meter will fit my 24 and also my 85. So I have a lens for, a filter for 2 lenses. A filter for 2 lenses. Now this is the variable N neutral density filter. If you're serious about photographing waterfalls, you should get this. And I recommend you the Tiffin 2 to 8 stops. A lot you can do with this. Again, this 67 will fit my 7200 or my 35 meter. And my 58 meter will fit my 24 meter and my 85. So So this could fit two different lenses and this can fit two different lenses. And the way to use the variable N neutral filter is you want to reduce the exposure by 4 or 5 stops. Depending on the lights, the speed of the waterfall, you want to use like an aperture of 18 and maybe 5 seconds. And if you need more light, just try increasing it by a second or 2 seconds, and you get a dramatic different shot. The level cube, where it's great for leveling your photography. It's great for having a straight line. You want to make sure that your tripod is mounted straight on the grounds, where the leg part is underneath the lens. Make sure the legs are straight, and then this will be effective. This level could help straighten any vertical or horizontal problems, like with the wide angle lens. A lot of times I use this, but sometimes I like to spend more time looking at the picture for different, composition and interest. This is called a Hoodman screen cover. This will work with any major modern camera screen. And the focus, you just turn this to focus and you get a good sharp focus on the screen. So this will help you look at the photograph in a really bright sunny day. Now the other option is with the mirrorless and other modern cameras, you can see the photograph by looking through the eyepiece. But if you don't want to strain your eyes so much, that's why they have the Hoodman. And this is great if you're photographing a waterfall on a somewhat sunny day. You'll see the photograph better. Now, I use tripods. I just take the tripod, either being my architect tripod, which is here on the right, or my landscape tripod, which is here on the left. And this I decided to cut off so I could put it low on the ground. I decided to leave this one on. A lot of times I like to start with ISO 100 or 200 with the tripod. Now, the IO tripod, depending on the light, I can go to ISO 3200, 1600, depending on the lights, how much light there is and what I want to do. For those coming in, this is, being recorded. And I recommend using a sturdy tripod like a Manfrotto or a good one, a carbon one, to hold the camera still, and also with a cable release. And maybe on a windy day, you might want to put like a weight of stone serving as a weight to bolt on the tripod. So my mirrorless R6, R5, R3. I recommend either. I like the R5, R6. But there are price differences between all. The R3 is the most expensive, and then the R5, but they're all very good. All very similar, but your R3s have some features that I felt like R5 and R6 was my camera, not the R3. And I'm very thankful for the Canon converter, where you can use your non-RF lenses. And I have a YouTube video on how I use the Canon R6. Also how I use the R5. So I'll show my YouTube channel later, but I have I have several sections. So these are my lenses I use for any still life or landscape photography. A lot of times I like to use my 7200 with the aperture 4. This is a nice, lightweight. It's not too heavy. It's lighter than the 2.8, but then sometimes I just like to use the EF35. But I've used these all. 24 for the wide, 85 for telephoto. My two non-prime lenses with the 7200, 100, 400. I like the prime lens because, of course, lower price, but also the sharper focus. But the zoom the modern, lens zooms are catching up. They're sharp or almost as sharp as the prime. Ambient stabilization, some systems like Nikon, Sony may call it vibrant reduction. I always have this turned off because a lot of times they use a tripod. So I turn it off. But if you use this feature, if you turn it on, make sure you're not using a tripod. Because if you use it with the tripod, you may have pixel problems. You may have color shift problems. So at the tripod, you turn it off, but I always have it turned off because a lot of times I do use a tripod in my work. Then you got the manual focus, autofocus. Outdoor photography, I like to use the autofocus. Maybe I could switch to manual, but a lot of times I just use the autofocus. Now for light painting and other, photography, with light painting, I like to start with an autofocus and switch to manual, or just regular autofocus for other still life. Then my camera cases, where I got these at a store called Micro Center. You could buy them maybe in a hardware store, but they're sturdy and tough. They don't take up a lot of space, and they're cheaper than the other camera cases. Now I am doing some research like Think Tank and BH. The prices of this stuff is coming down, but I still use these cases today. Camera settings for the R6, R5. On the right, it's the R5. The file is 45 meg. I like to be with the C RAW, the condensed RAW. And I like to use a JPEG for the Wi-Fi. So that I convert my C RAW to the DNG. I edit the DNG. And the caption on the left, it's my R6. Use a C, the RAW and the S2. The S2 is a small JPEG. So if I want to view my JPEG on my phone, they'll view the JPEG. But I do all my editing in the RAW. I convert it to DNG, then I add the DNG. This is the general diagram, landscape. To do with ambient light, you might want to cut the shutter in half before raising the aperture. But a lot of times I like to, since I'm doing waterfalls, this would be f/18, this would be like 5 seconds. You want to make sure your ISO is 100. And I never use auto ISO because I want to control the ISO by setting it to 100. And for regular waterfalls, I like to use manual. For like other photography, light painting, I like these manual or bulb. And here, I'm sitting in a condensed RAW plus the small JPEG. JPEG's for the Wi-Fi, and the C RAW is where I edit it after I convert it to a GNG. Broad mode, light painting, any type of photography, still life, landscape. I want to be with the single shooting mode because when you take a waterfall picture, landscape, using a cable release, I want to work in one shot at a time. Now, if you use other modes, the 10-second to 2-second for self-portraits, H plus H, these are all good to use, but for waterfalls, I recommend using the single shooting mode. The picture style mode, I like to use the standard, which is the sharpest. It applies a little sharpening. For the portrait landscape, the standard's a little sharper, but they're good for their environments. I know some people use monochrome, but I don't use monochrome. I don't want to affect the raw pixels. I want to do all my, black and white in Photoshop. And then you have 1, 2, 3. These are for user-defined settings. Some people use a wide aperture, a fast shutter, these other settings. N, which means neutral, which means no settings applied. And I use the standard. The monochromes are black and white, and these have certain settings, but I just like to use it as standard. The focus mode, I just like to use it the zone autofocus, where you look at several parts of the photograph. I find that I like this before more than the 1053 point, but these are all good to use. And I've used the 1053. But in regular still life, I like to use the auto, but I've used the 1053 and it works well with waterfalls. I've also tested out the vertical and horizontal. They work well. You get the single point of focus. You just move the cursor where you want the focus. And you get the spot auto focus, where it's great for macro photography. It's like a super intelligent single point of focus. Then you got tracking, where basically if you want to enable the face, eyes, vehicles, animals, you turn it on. It's AI applied to the image, but I've used it, but I use it without. I didn't know too much of a difference, but a lot of times I just like to use the zone autofocus. White balance, I either use a daylight white balance, or I set the Kelvin to 5600. I've been setting the Kelvin to 5600 because that looks like the most natural daylight. Now, I never use AWS, auto white balance. Some people call this all wrong white balance, but it's at least natural. Look at the temperature. That's a big temperature range, 3000 to 7000. You're better off using the daylight preset or setting the custom 5600. And these other, like depending if it's a cloudy, you're better off using a cloudy preset than auto, or tungsten or white. These have more specific temperatures. You can also do custom white balance, where you take a picture of a white card and you set it. If the light changes, you have to do new custom white balance. The high IS speed, ISO noise reduction. The problem exposed image, I'd rather just disable it. You could use low, but you should avoid using high. Unless you're using a very high ISO, but we have software like Topaz or Camera Raw that could take out the noise. So I'd avoid using standard. I would just disable this. Just make, as long as the image is properly exposed. Long exposure noise reduction. Probably disable it, but you can use auto. Enable is algorithms are happening when you take the photograph, so it may take the screen a while to get back. I would not use a setting for like fireworks. I would disable it. Color space. Some people start with Pro Photo, which is 281 trillion colors, but the human eye can only recognize 2 or 3 million colors. I like to start with the Adobe RGB, which is 57 billion, then convert it to sRGB, then you're only stuck with 16.7 million colors. And then there's 2 ways you could use the sRGB. When you post to the web, make sure you check off convert to sRGB profile. But when you copy and paste a photograph, don't check it off, because if you do, you could have a color mismatch problem. And then the CMYK, then you're only stuck with 17,000 colors. It's good for printing. But I just start with, from Adobe RGB and then use sRGB. It's 2 ways. Cropping aspect ratio. I use full because I want to use all the pixels. I want to have all the pixel power. 1.6, 1.1, 4.3, 16.9, they don't use all the pixel power. 1.6 is great for the crop sensor for the central C lens, but I like to use full because I'm using full frame. The auto exposure bracketing. I know some people that use many more than 3 stops, but I just like to use a regular, a stop over, and a stop under. What I use expose for the highlights, where so the overexposed image, well, the one that's over stopped, there won't be, hopefully it won't be any blinkies. That means I can use all the pixels of the image. And I like to use, HDR for outdoor. Get the continuous AF, where when I bought my R6, the thing was always be focusing, so I would just turn it to manual to make the thing quiet. But then you could also disable it. What this means is the camera will focus when you press the button. When you focus by pressing the button. If you were to enable it, the thing is always be focusing. That's why you want to disable it. So when you disable it, you're in control of the focus, not the camera always, adjusting the focus. I have 1/3 for everything, for shutter, aperture, ISO. I use three bracket shots for HDR. The number of bracketed shots, you could have many more than 3, probably 9, probably more than that, but I just want to keep it simple by using 3. Now the card recording features, the Canon R5, R6, they both can read the XC and HC ending cards. The XC card has great speed and performance, has great space. It's a lot greater than the HC ending card. Then you got the Type B express memory card, and I use my data on that card. It's great for data. It's also really great for 4K and full HD video. And you have great speeds. You have read speed 1750 megabytes per second, write speed 1,000 megabytes per second. So, and their cars are even more advanced than that, but they're more expensive, so you get what you pay for. So the Express Type B, it's a great card that can be used in many ways, and only the R5. And in many ways, you could use 2 cards. You could record to multiple cards. You could have it switch to a card when card 1's full. You just record separately. Now I'm going to go into Adobe Camera Raw. So I don't see anything questions in the chat, but I can pause for questions if you have any. So we're in the camera crawl, and what I'm going to do, if you look at the speed, we have aperture 16, shutter 10. Aperture 16, shutter 10 seconds. Aperture 18, 6 seconds. So, and I did this all with a variable N neutral density filter. So basically, I right click, I go to Camera Raw. I always want to have the texture at 2 or 3. And maybe I can play with the contrast. I like to leave the highlights and shadows alone. Sometimes I could go -15, but +15. Some photographers, they put an S curve. I like to leave this alone. and I never touch the sliders below it. Some photographers, depending on what they're photographing, some people use 120 for people, but 140 or greater for products. But I'll leave this section alone. This is worth experimenting in black and white, but I do all my black and white in Photoshop. In color grading, where you work with the midtones separately, shadows separately, highlights separately. You can work with them all at once by pressing global. You get options where remove chromatic aberration, use profile corrections. It shows the lens that I'm using, 70-200, and a camera. When you say remove chromatic aberration, it removes all the color problems of the image. In geometry, I just want to click the A. See, no upright correction found. In the effects, I could put in vignetting, I could take it out. And if I want to make this a black and white, some people, what they do, they negative out the vibrance and then negative out the saturation. Not going to save any changes. And if I want to use the similar characteristics, the opening camera raw. Suppose I made the changes on this file. I'm moving the cursor. I would do sync settings to make sure I extract off geometry, click OK, and then I click done. And I make sure that I'm using the same, aperture settings, or I just do them separately. I'm going to do a new screen share. We're going to go into Adobe Photoshop. Where I'm going to open up, let's see, we'll do 4 at a time. So I'm going to use my navigator. I'm going to move my thing over. I'm going to make my screen a little smaller. Make my screen a little smaller, a lot smaller. First thing I want to do, I have an action, I'll get the first 2 layers. I run this action, run this action. It runs this and it makes a copy of the layer. So it does auto tone, auto contrast, and auto color, one right after the other. So I do this action when I do landscape. Then I run this action where basically I run this action. It produces this. So I burn luminosity blend mode, dodge, screen. Now when I do burn, the opacity of the brush I find my brush. There's my brush. I just want to be with opacity 100, normal blend brush mode. When I dodge, I want to put this down to maybe 25. because I wanted to make it look natural. So that I'm, dodging with the screen blend mode. And you have levels. I just, let's see, I push the auto and I just like to make it a little more darker to make it more contrast. So when I run this action, there'll be another type signature layer, but I usually delete the one in black and I keep the one in white. So I always delete a signature layer that I don't need. If I were to put this in, if I were to put some sharpening, I'd do dust and scratches, which is the fill filter, have it to 1.3. And the speckle, there's no prompt. And then the high pass, I make a change to like 10 or 11, and I click OK. And then if I run this action, and this is the last one, it's soft light. Puts it in the blend mode, but I'm using, the high pass. Because I want to put a frame on. Where it plays this action and this action calls other actions. And then the condition, which is here, based on the file size, if the width is greater, it'll come and play this action. If the height is bigger, it'll come and play this action. I'm going to push F12. I'll bring it back to the original state. Do the same thing. I do run this action where I come down over here. So I'm going to duplicate the layer, which is here, and then I play this action. It produces this and this. And then I run this action where I run this action, which is, luminosity. I burn with luminosity, I dodge with the screen, and then I have a levels, click auto, and then adjust the contrast by the midtones. And then I delete my black signature. Do the same thing. You duplicate the layer, and I play this action. I produce this and this. And then this is the second thing where luminosity, burn with luminosity. I dodge with the screen, but I want to make sure that I use a lower percentage, passing maybe 50, 25, or 10, because I like the way this looks. Do the same thing. Run this action, I duplicate the layer, and then I put this on. I'm going to run another action where the last action, which is high pass, so high pass, change the aperture like 10 or 15. Good sharp with contrast, where I have soft lights. Then I have dodge and burn, where I burn at a velocity blend mode. The screen at a dodge, but I use a lower opacity. That's why this is slightly gray. And this starts out a block because white reveals, black hides. And I click on this, and then if I want to make it a little darker, I just note the midtones. I am recording it. I'm recording this meeting too, so I'm gonna do another 4 Photoshop files. So this, I use the same actions. Now, when I do an export, what I say for the web, it should be at 100. Sometimes the default 60. Make sure I convert to sRGB. And you can see the file sizes. And then suppose I want to put a frame. So I go to my actions. Now, when I do this, the image size is, the height's obviously the biggest, so it's 4,000. I have the resolution at 200 pixels per inch. And the resample method is automatic. It produces a nice key line. I go to my actions. I'm gonna make it bigger so you can. Where I get this frame where is it apply this action? Is it look for this action? Does it come down over here? I'll do these steps. I'll look for this action, play it. And calls this action. And it come back to over here, condition. Where if the document is if the width is bigger, if the document's landscape, is going to call the big width. And the big width, the width will be automatically set to 4,000 pixels. And if it's big height, the height is automatically set to 4,000 pixels. So a lot of times I have to reset my workspace where my layers, my screen navigator, my brush. And a new screen share. Let's see. Now I'm going to talk about some screenshots where first going to start with Adobe Camera Raw, and then we'll talk about Photoshop. So Adobe Camera Raw, it's the same thing as Lightroom, same interface. Now, I always want to set the white balance by clicking the dropper here. There's many ways I can use this. For light painting, I just set the white balance. Other photography, if I don't like the highlights, I could zero out the highlights. I could plus out the shadows. For black and white, some people, they negative out the vibrance. They negative out the saturation. I do all my black and white in Photoshop. If the clarity and texture, I want to have between 2 and 3. Sometimes be 5 and 7, but I've been using 2 and 3, and I like that better. And I could increase or decrease the exposure. I could work with this contrast. So there's a lot you can do with this, basic tab. Some photographers, they have an S for good contrast. Some people say to leave this alone. I've been not touching this, and I never touched the highlights, so I don't really use this tab anymore. Sharpening, some photographers, they sharpen at 120. I used to do 140, but I've been leaving this tab alone because I did some research and it's better. But if you want to do the color noise reduction, I'm going to blow your screen up to 300 and see black dots. You want to increase until you don't see it. So look at the photograph. Don't worry about the number so much. You want to make sure that you play fit and view when you're done. But I don't touch this area. Now I do use this area. The R7, R6, R5, this is automatically checked. Remove chromatic aberration, you take away problems of the colors of the edges. Use profile correction, you have Canon. It'll tell you the camera you're using. I forgot what shot it in, but it'll state the camera, EF 100 to 400. Probably a bird at Conomingo Dam or something. But a lot of times, in the studio, I use the Canon prime lenses, but landscape, waterfalls, I use prime and non-prime. For geometry, I either click the A or this thing next to the A. The A will take care of a lot of the problems. Now, verticals and horizontals, I want to do that in Photoshop. This is my preference. You get the vignetting, where if you want to put vignetting, you make it very slight. If you want it heavy, to make it heavy, but look at the photograph. Don't worry about the numbers. There's other techniques in Photoshop where you could use a gradient map to make a boring sky more interesting. Now, the image processor, this is where if you want to quickly convert a raw image to JPEGs, and depending on what I want to do, if I want to save to the web, I want to make sure this is checked. If I want to copy and paste in Photoshop, I want to leave this unchecked. And Photoshop. The HR auto, I have at least 3 HDR images where I select the images and I run this and it does auto align and auto blend. But I only use this for, HDR bracketed shots. I always like to start with this if it's single exposure, where I do the levels, auto, levels, contrast, and levels, black and white. Get the tone, the contrast, and the color. Then, beginning set of actions, I like to make a copy of this and run this action, where it comes on here and does its thing. And it saves. This is basically, I could save in Photoshop, or I can have an action that does it. And these actions, either one action or I do them in groups. Got the dodge or burn, combo where I play this action, I burn with the luminosity blend mode, I dodge with the screen blend mode. I have a black signature and a white signature, and I usually delete the black or maybe the white. I delete one or the other. And for the auto, with the levels, I like to click the auto to balance out the colors. And then I just, adjust the tone for more contrast. I usually make it darker. So I'd be adjusting the midtones. Now, you got some background actions where dust and scratches, just here, these are the 1.3. There's no prompt for the speckle. You got the high pass. The high pass, the blend those at soft light. It's good for, sharpening with contrast. You got a frame where I have 2 actions. This action comes over here, and it calls this action, and it calls this action. So this happens, and it come back over here, calls a condition, the big width, the big height. This is after I run this action, this frame action. After all this happens, you have 4,000 because the width is the longest. You have the unsharp mask where if I do this for a filter alone, I just want to have it at 200. I'm going to use 1.0 for the pixels. I know some people use 1.5, but I want to keep it at 1.0. I feel like that's the best thing. Maybe I could use 1.5, but I just want to keep it at 1. And the threshold, a good contrast is between 6 and 7 level. Another background actions where you have the speckle, which is no prompt. You have the scratches. You have the unsharp mask with the fade. So the fade will show the last filter you used. And I always want to use the luminosity at 100%. It's good for contrast. Another way to set of background actions, we have the speckle, you have the unsharp mask, you have dozen scratches. This is without the fade. I'm going to save a JPEG. I'm going to go with the quality 100, and I want to ask every time I export it. So when I run the action, you have to navigate. Then when you run it again, Photoshop is smart enough to remember where you last saved your image. If it's posting to the web, I want to have that convert the sRGB. The other export, we have export, quality be 100. Save for the web so that format would be JPEG, in the sRGB, you'd be checked. Convert the sRGB. And, you know, Photoshop, remember the next time, if you still have your program open, they'll just save it automatically where you saved it before. You have action, edit with paste, where you make a copy and you paste in place. So if you have two images of the same thing, where this image is here, they'll paste it in the other image. It's great for light painting. When I paste in place, I always with the blend, light and blend mode. Frequency separation, where this is great for cloning. Some photographers, they have a separate high frequency for all cloning tools. Then the low frequency is when you use your blurs, your Gaussian blurs. The linear light and the low is at a regular blend mode. Black and white, there's many ways. I love the experience with the channel mixer, where I zero out all the orange, red, greens, and blues. Sometimes I check off the monochromatic, sometimes I don't. The vibrant, we can just negative out the vibrance and saturation. Gradient map, I like to use a blend mode of color. And the same thing with the threshold, blend mode of color. And then saturation, just want to negative out the vibrance and, you know, saturation. And the lightness would be like, it's like the midtones of a levels adjustment layer. And then more complicated black and white with many adjustment layers. This is my workflow looks like. So you're welcome to join any of my groups. My Still Life Fine Art Photography Creative Group has over 2,000 members. It's growing every day. My Architect, Design, and Cityscape Facebook group has about 200 members. And some of these groups are running by myself, some with other people. That's organized several meetup clubs. And this is my fine art site. I do light paintings, plexiglass work, old-fashioned glass. I'm glad you like this information. I am going to post the recording. And then you saw my portfolio. Here is my YouTube, where I have a playlist where I will post the recording here. Got equipment and still life and light painting, got light painting webinars, black plexus webinars, Adobe software at still life, and white plexus webinars. So I checked the chat. I got some good comments. Does anyone have any questions? You can always email me at mpetrilliart2016@gmail.com. Put my email in the chat. And then you can also get in touch with Facebook, Instagram. I'm always on Instagram. My latest light paintings. I'm glad you liked it. So what I'll do So I will post this recording. I'll stop the screen share. I don't see any questions. Maybe you like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks for letting me give this presentation. And I will post the recording shortly. Very soon.